Hi, welcome back to the Export Impact Podcast. It's easy to forget that we're all connected by a network of more than 1 million kilometers of undersea cable laying on the ocean floor. These cables transmit vast amounts of data at about 1/3 of the speed of light. And depending on where you are, those systems might be the reason you're hearing my voice right now. My next guest knows a thing or two about submarine internet cable. Nicholas Chinappi is the Director of Contracts and Risk Management at IT International Telecom, one of only a dozen or so companies in the world offering this kind of service. Their work spans nearly 30 years and has reached more than 65 countries. I'd like to begin today's episode by acknowledging that we're recording from my office in Toronto, which is on the traditional unceded territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We value taking this moment to deepen the appreciation of our Indigenous communities wherever we are and to remind ourselves of our shared debt to Canada's First Peoples. Welcome to the show, Nick. Just before we dive in, no pun intended, I want to understand exactly what IT International Telecom does. Laying cables underwater sounds like no easy feat.
Yeah, sure thing. So IT International Telecom was founded in 1995 and has since grown to owning and operating 3 vessels spanning from 115 meters in length, which is more or less equivalent to the length of a football field, to our smallest vessel, which is 72 meters in length. These vessels are equipped with highly specialized equipment, which lay and repair subsea fiber optic networks. As you mentioned, Joe, these networks are responsible for between 98 and 99% of all global internet and communications traffic. Somewhat of a myth is that most communications go about via satellite, which is not true. Most pass through fiber networks, some of which we install all underneath the ocean. A bit more about IT is we're located here in Pointe Claire in Montreal. We also have a eastern and western coast presence in Halifax on the East Coast, which is our marine facility of excellence. And we have a presence in BC as well.
And tell me now, you've been in business since 1995. How long have you been with the company?
I've been with IT now for 7 years.
7 years. So how was the company founded? How do you start a business like, I'm going to start laying cable on an ocean floor? What is the genesis of that?
Well, 2 of the 3 founders of the company still work here today, are very heavily involved in the day-to-day operations. In fact, it's a spin-off from Teleglobe, which was a telecommunications operator, and they spun that off and they founded IT International Telecom. They started building and operating cable landing stations, which are at the terminal ends on land, more on the construction side, and then they pivoted to the subsea world of laying and installing these fiber optic systems underwater.
Wow. And with the terrain being so wild, I mean, some of the depths that you're dealing with are pretty incredible. I would imagine these ships that you have, these 350-foot vessels, must be quite complicated pieces of equipment.
Indeed, they're highly specialized. The equipment that is on them is very unique. I would say in the world, there are about 50 to 60 vessels that serve the global community in installing and repairing these cables. Some systems, depending on how they're engineered, either the cable is laid directly on the seafloor or it's buried with a large plow into the seafloor at full ocean depth. So if the waters are 8,000 meters in depth, then the cables sit on the bottom at that depth. There's no real constraint. The cable itself needs to be manufactured in a specific type of way for certain waters. But that being said, they typically go as deep as the ocean floor.
Incredible. And that's not all the company does, right? I understand the company is also involved in desktop study and marine surveys, etc. Tell us a little bit about that.
IT is a full turnkey provider in these systems, meaning we provide to our customers the entire package, which starts from as you mentioned, the desktop study phase. Desktop study essentially is, as the name suggests, a study that's done at a desktop level, which comprises of research across various fields like the ocean, environment, animal habitats, geology, so on and so forth. And coupled with that is we send some of our specialists to site to determine where is the best location for these cables to land onshore. So if you think of a typical landing on a beach somewhere, after the desktop study, the outcome or the output of that study is a preliminary route. So if you think of connecting 2 points across a body of water, the desktop study will outline how that cable is routed through the water and informs the length and the type of armoring that is required on the cable, depending on what the study reveals. And then after that phase is the marine survey, which essentially requires the deployment of a specialized survey vessel, which serves to confirm or to finalize the route that was developed in the desktop study phase. So you can imagine a vessel that is deployed that collects subsea data, informs the composition of the seabed using various equipment and technologies. So as the vessel maps the floor, then you have a better idea of exactly how the cable needs to be engineered, after which, once you have a final engineered length or cable, you could then place an order with the manufacturer. We don't manufacture cable in-house. We outsource it to various vendors and they fabricate the cable for us. And then the final stage is the installation and the commissioning of the network.
Amazing. It sounds like a very complicated process. How many employees does the company have?
Our company has grown. We're about 200 employees now, including our offshore fleet. So spread between our office locations and on our ships, we're more or less 200, give or take. We'll upsize based on certain contracts that we have that are more labor intensive, but more or less 200.
And you said that there's 50 or 60 vessels in the world that do the kind of work that you do. Are there Canadian competitors that you have, or are you alone in the Canadian market?
We are generally alone in the Canadian marketplace that does the type of work that we do at the level that we do. There are smaller players, but they don't have the type of assets or capabilities and ships that we possess. So in that sense, when you're talking about large infrastructure projects, we basically dominate the Canadian space.
Wow. And what's COVID been like for the business? Have you had challenges during the COVID period? What transpired during that and how did it affect you?
COVID was a bit of a double-edged sword for the business in that it presented very difficult challenges, but it also presented opportunities indirectly. So I'll start with the challenges. As at any one time during a project between 60, 70, up to 80 crew members, and these crew members work on rotations. So you can imagine, for example, shifts consisting of 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 6 weeks off, depending on the role and the type of work that's required. During the height of the pandemic, certain countries, Canada being one of them, basically grounded airplanes to international travel. Some ports were also closed to people disembarking from vessels. You may recall with cruise ships, a very vivid memory is when we did a large project in Chile in South America, where some of our crew members were out at sea for weeks at a time. They were unable to fly back home to Canada and to their respective homes because the ports in Chile didn't allow them to disembark, which meant we had to sail the vessel with all the crew members. So instead of, hopping on a flight for 12 hours, for example, and returning home, they had to stay on the ship for an additional 20 or 30 days, however long it took for the vessel to sail back home. And in that, the company, from a corporate perspective, you incur more costs in doing so. It was challenging for our crew members physically as well. There's a familial aspect as well, which presented its unique challenges. And for the business, we always had to find creative ways of how to enter, exit different countries, regions, ports, airports. At one point, it was daily meetings in our boardroom on how we're going to actually implement these systems, which in themselves are very important for people because it allows them to communicate. And then I can speak to the opportunity that presented even before COVID. A lot of countries around the world had as mandates to connect all of their people by certain timelines. Canada, for example, their goal is by 2030, all Canadians will be connected to the internet. So that was a goal pre-pandemic. And what the pandemic did was accelerate those goals. So what we've seen by various countries, institutions, and even from the private markets, a large deployment of capital towards new investment, new infrastructure, new communication systems, just because of all of the work from home, telemedicine, teleeducation, and really the explosion of data. And it was very challenging. And I'm glad those days are behind us from a logistics and a management perspective.
Yeah, it must have been very difficult on the crew to have to stay those extra days and be away from their families, and must have been a very difficult time for them.
Sure was. And that wasn't unique to us. So all seafarers around the world, which helped keep the world moving and moving cargo and all the goods that we procure and buy and consume, all the food that we consume as well. It was a global challenge, I'm sure, to other companies like us and the rest of the markets.
Yeah, for sure. And there was also supply chain issues. Did you have supply chain issues as well in terms of getting cable materials produced and manufactured?
We did on various fronts. So the commodities market was shaken quite a bit. Lead times of months became several months. So lead times doubled. And we have a backstop for implementation of our projects. So we saw schedule compression. Also, the labor markets were challenging as well. The labor market remains tight. Supply of spare pieces of equipment and parts. So just because these vessels are so specialized, most parts are not available in North America, and we really need to rely on the European markets for specialized parts and spares. And that posed a very great challenge as well. And the mere fact that they were either not obtainable or the lead times were doubled and tripled. So that also had an impact as well. These vessels consume a lot of fuel. If we had fixed contracts on one side and fuel costs rise, well, we saw margin compression as well. So it was very challenging, and fuel remains a challenge because prices at the pump are still high.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, this is a company that goes back to 1995. It's never easy to export from Canada. Certainly back in 95, I think much more challenging than today where communication is so simple. Tell us how many countries you're in. What was the first overseas project that got the company in that mode of exporting and being a global player?
I need to be honest, Joe. I don't know where the company worked for its first project globally, but I do know most of our business is global. So on the export side, most of our revenues are generated outside of Canada. The industry is global in nature. As companies develop these systems, tenders or requests for proposals are launched to the global market. So we're really not confined to Canada in that sense. And if we only relied on Canada, we wouldn't exist today. The export market is huge for us. We've worked in 65 to 70 different countries. Just in the last year or so, we've worked in the United States, in various states, in Colombia, Chile, Guyana, in the Caribbean. We worked in the UK, France, Morocco. Good geographical mix in our portfolio.
What are the challenges in dealing with so many different countries, some of the business risks, some of the legal issues, regulatory issues? How do you manage all of that?
We try to get ahead of that at the front end. So when we're in the bidding phase of our projects, we perform an internal risk assessment. We look at various risks across different geographies. So for example, if we're bidding for work in country X, we'll analyze the political situation or political stability of that country. Anywhere you work in the world now, permits are required. So there's evaluations and assessments on the permitting front. What's required for our vessels to clear in to specific countries. So certain countries have specific requirements. We may need to rely on our insurance partners to buy certain insurance products. We may need to alter our port calls, really ensure we comply with local rules and regulations. We do so internally, and also we engage local agents who can advise us on what's required in terms of customs clearances and customs formalities. So there's a whole body of work that occurs at the front end. And then during the management phase and implementation phase of the project, a lot of things to keep on top of.
It's actually pretty similar to the surveys that you do in the ocean. You've got to do the same sort of surveys as you go into each of these countries, right? To make sure you don't go offside. So you must have quite the contacts in many of these countries. Is it something that is very specific to your industry? Is there like a world of lawyers and consultants that work in your industry in each of these countries that you tap into?
There are very specific legal counsel in various countries that are experts, as you pointed, in their respective fields. So, for example, the United States has their own set of cabotage rules as to what is allowed, what is not allowed when working in the U.S. waters, what custom clearance entails. So there are a specific set of lawyers who specialize in advising foreign flagged ships to enter and to clear customs. Exactly to your point, we have a network of partners that are knowledgeable in those specific fields that without, we'd be walking in blind basically, because there are no two countries that are alike, not only culturally, but also from the authority perspective, what's permissible, what's not permissible, and what is really required to clear it.
Is the business as complicated as it sounds?
It's very niche, complicated. I would say so. It would be very difficult for someone to come in here and let's say there would be an outside investor and they would want to purchase the company. Well, they wouldn't really be able to without retaining any type of local knowledge. It's so specific and niche. And I came from the life insurance space before I joined here, and I knew little to nothing about this space. And the learning curve was very steep. It's quite challenging, but that's what keeps it interesting.
It sounds extremely interesting. All the different countries and so many different issues that you're dealing with, such a unique service that you provide. Are there any programs or services that you rely on to maintain your competitiveness on the global stage?
There are, and EDC is a valuable partner in that regard. As one example, they provide us with several products which help us not only compete, but give us, I would say, financial security with regards to, for example, credit insurance or accounts receivable insurance. So basically guaranteeing that our receivables will be honored, guarantees on letters of credit that are issued by our banks. So they back that up. So our banks feel more comfortable in issuing guarantees to our customers, which are requirements in tender or in requests for proposals. They allow us to comply with the requirements of these documents. And if we wouldn't comply, then we wouldn't have the opportunity to compete and win the work. And also, financing facilities that EDC offers. What that does from a practical sense is it allows us to take on a bit more in bidding on contracts and undertaking the work, which we may otherwise not bid on, if not for the insurance blanket or safety net. And risk equals growth. And if you don't take the risk, you'll stay stagnant and you'll fall out of bounds.
I would think that is quite an advantage having EDC in your corner and providing all of those different financing options. And it would probably be very difficult to get a Schedule A bank to support that kind of risk because they are so risk averse. But I think that's what's so great about it is that it allows you to grow internationally, be in all these countries and bring all of that great revenue back into Canada, which is what we all want. I just want to switch gears a little bit. Everybody is so concerned about global warming, the environment, and everything that's going on with that. And I think all companies today have to take that into account. I would think that with the amount of work that you're doing in the oceans and everybody being so concerned about that, I would love to know sort of how you're managing that, what the company's goals are, and the challenges in trying to manage all of these expectations, and whether or not governments are putting extra pressure on you in the way you conduct business, with ESG being such a buzz acronym right now?
From an environmental perspective, no project can proceed without permits. So that's as a rule of thumb. These cables cannot be laid anywhere in the world. So in Canada, for example, at the very infancy of any type of project, there are assessments that are done, whether they're environmental or otherwise. And the process is quite elaborate. The various authorities are engaged in issuing these permits. So for any work in Canada, as part of the permit in principle that's required to deploy these subsea systems, an authorization is required from Environment Canada. So due diligence is done in that regard. Permits are also required from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, who are responsible for ocean and marine life. So they assess the impact of the project, and then they determine whether or not it respects the environment and wildlife. And they also, as a condition to issuing those permits, they may enforce attenuation measures that we take on to ensure that the impact to the environment and to the wildlife is kept at a minimum. That's unique to Canada when it comes to DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans. But I would say as the world evolves, more and more countries have similar infrastructure at the government level that ensures oversight and that ensures that contractors, as ourselves, comply with regulations.
I can just imagine. Now, I understand you're doing a project in the Arctic, and that must be pretty interesting because you've got a compressed amount of time to work up there. So not only do you have the normal challenges, but you've also got this additional challenge of having to do the work in a compressed amount of time. You must put a lot of good planning into that in order to be able to complete that work accordingly.
That's right. The window of operability is very small. So we're talking anywhere between 2 to 4 months, depending on the year. So some winters are worse than others. I would say planning for any type of project from start to finish takes about 2 years. So when you start the desktop study phase, but working in the Arctic where resources are limited, access to industrialized ports are at a great distance, it's prudent to plan a year in advance.
That's really quite interesting. Now, with respect to the amount of competition you have, you said that you have competition. There's 60 vessels around the world. How do you see growth in light of that competition? Where do you think growth is going to come from? You mentioned satellites. That was a really interesting statistic that I wasn't aware of. I was one of the uninformed that thought that a lot of our communication came from satellites. I knew that they laid a lot of cable during the gold rush of the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s, but I did think that it was supplanted by satellites. But that is so interesting that it's, what'd you say, 90%? Was it 90%, 95%?
It's 98 to 99%.
98 to 99, which is
of global communications. When you think about it, payments through banking systems, financial transactions, stock exchanges, buying and selling goods online, YouTube, Netflix, Facebook, everything is so data intensive that the demand for more bandwidth has exploded recently. And I've read certain papers published online, and that demand will continue to grow. And in terms of where do we see growth? Lately, there's been a big push, I would say, in the last 10 years for the big internet giants around the world to own and operate their own systems, namely, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. So they're deploying their own systems and they're diversifying away from utilizing the big carriers, the big telecom operators. So they have their own fibers and their own networks. And so there's growth in that, major data hubs around the world. Think of the New Yorks of the world, Londons, Tokyo. They will continue to prosper. But where we see growth, at least in the Canadian market and also abroad, is as more governments push as a mandate to connect all of their citizens, that will really trigger an explosion of new systems, new investment, new development. So right now we see a lot of growth in the Arctic. And really any underserved community that's not served by internet right now, we believe eventually they will be served one day.
Yeah, amazing. Well, one of the things I think about is with all that cable at the bottom of the ocean, what happens when you get some happening and their cable breaks down or there's some natural catastrophe that causes a cable to get damaged? Is there Internet of Things that sort of tied into all these cables that automatically tell you where the break is and how you can get to it so that it could get repaired?
Well, we also repair cable systems as well. As soon as there's a cable break, you can measure exactly where the break occurs. And once there is a break, we provide maintenance service for our customers as well. Once their systems break, they advise us of the location of breaks and we use our vessels to go repair the cables. The frequency and the severity of storms has increased in recent years. They cause cable systems to break. There's more maritime activity in general, so more vessel traffic. A lot of causes of these cable breaks are from fishermen that are dragging their anchors and their fishing equipment. Also, vessels that are dragging their anchors. As global warming increases and weather patterns become more and more severe, there are more breaks to these cables. As there's more international trade and marine traffic, the frequency of breaks increases as well. And on the supply side, there's more and more development. So what we're seeing is more cables being implemented and more breaks as well, which keeps the global fleet of 50 to 60 vessels quite active.
Just amazing. I really enjoyed this. It's a fascinating conversation, a view into an industry that I didn't know very much about that I'm sure people who are listening are going to very much enjoy. Just learning about this business and really how technical it is and how diverse it is and how many different disciplines one has to have in order to be able to succeed in this type of industry. Kudos to you. Kudos to your team. You've done an amazing job. Very proud that you are a Canadian company and doing such great work in so many different countries. Nick, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Thanks for joining us today on the Export Impact Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on your favorite streaming platform. See you back here in 2 weeks.